What's up, y'all? It's your girl, J. Renee with Prison Riot Radio. I hope that you're doing well. This morning, we got Brother Basil on the phone, okay, a.k.a. Donell J. Blount Sr., and he's going to talk to us about two cases out of Virginia where detectives used illegal practices to get their convictions. So we're going to jump right into it. Good morning. How you doing, bro?
Good morning, sis. How are you? I'm doing all right.
I'm doing well, thank you. I appreciate you making it back again. We've definitely spoke with you before. Wealth of information, putting the people first. So I appreciate you for still, being that brother, and letting us know what's going
Absolutely.
on. So let's jump right into it, bro. So what's going on in
Right.
Virginia?
My absence has not been for lack of being busy. I told you that anytime I bring something to your show, I want to do my due diligence to research the facts. I am in behind the T-wall, so I have to make sure that before I give anything out there for public consumption, I have researched things to the fullest. I have a thing that I do when a brother brings me a case. I play devil's advocate. I try to beat their claims down. I try not to see things from their perspective. I try to find evidence to refute anything that they're bringing to me. Because if they can't survive the scrutiny that I subject them to, it's going to be hard for them to take something back to court or to public officials and ask them to believe them. Right now, I have two cases that have been disturbing me for quite a while. I've been working on this particular case for the last 3 years since I came back from Colorado. There's a disgraced detective out of Norfolk, Virginia named Robert Glenn Ford. Back in 2010, he was indicted by a federal grand jury for extortion, 2 counts of extortion and 1 charge of lying to the FBI. According to U.S. District Court records, Ford was being paid by criminals to provide them with assistance in their cases. And so what Ford would do was he would tell prosecutors and judges that criminals were his informants and had provided crucial help in homicides when actually they provided no help at all, according to their. And these guys actually later would testify in court. Some of them said they had never even met Ford in person. And Ford and his partners, some of his co-workers described him as having and being involved in Norfolk for having solved nearly 200 homicides, and he kept the identity of many of his so-called informants secret, which was problematic. So his reputation was sullied even amongst his colleagues, but they didn't do anything to remove him from the position but once. In a juvenile case back in 1994, it came up that he had fudged the evidence against the juvenile in a murder case. And he was temporarily demoted. The department allegedly cleared him and restored him to the detective unit, where he would go on and wreak havoc for approximately 30 years, man. If you remember the case called the Norfolk Four, there were 4 sailors who were convicted of raping and robbing one of their neighbors. And the short version is these guys all confessed, but they said that the tactics that Ford utilized to extract these confessions with them basically amounted to they were mentally tortured. Well, it turns out that these 4 guys who were friends, one of the guys had an alibi that he was not in this. He was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and he remembered the day because it was his birthday. His lawyers actually traveled to Pennsylvania and discovered that this guy was not even in the state of Virginia when this crime was committed, but yet he confessed, which shows that there are tactics that police can utilize that will put so much mental pressure on a person that will cause them to admit to doing something that they had nothing to do with whatsoever. And the witness that actually named this guy as being involved was subject to the same mental torture that caused him to name the person in the first place. So these guys were eventually let go by then Governor Tim Kaine. The problem was that there was a 5th guy that had nothing to do with these friends, whose DNA evidence was actually at the scene, and he eventually admitted to the rape and the murder, and it had nothing to do with these 4 guys. One guy, and I just read his case recently, he was out and he was on probation. And his probation was getting ready to expire, and he was still having a problem getting the governors of Virginia to exonerate him. All right, that gives you a little background about Ford. He even went so far as he was taking crime line money. So he would give false information to guys to call in the crime line. He would claim as an investigator also that these tips led to an arrest, pay the people money, and then he would get a cut of the money. Like, this dude was wicked on all levels. Okay, now like I said, quick background on Ford. You can look him up, Detective Robert Glenn Ford out of Norfolk, Virginia. He was convicted in federal court in 2010 for 2 counts of extortion and 1 count of lying to the FBI. The problem is that, remember, he's been involved in so-called solving almost 200 murder investigations in Portsmouth. In Norfolk. Now, here's my guy. There are 2 of them, they're brothers. I met the first brother when I was at Sussex. He's actually he leads the Islamic community up there. He and I became great friends. His brother has recently come here in the compound with me, but I knew them both at Sussex because they used to come to the law library. When they began to tell me about the case, I'm gonna tell you right now, I was like, dude, there's no way that a detective could have done these things and it was allowed to go unchecked for so long. And I began to scrutinize what they were telling me. Well, I began to show them different investigative tactics they could use to try to ferret out information from the case that was being hidden in the case files. They kept telling me about a witness, a guy named Kenny Parker. This is a very unique individual here. This guy came to court and he testified under oath that he did not want to be there that day, and that he had only appeared in court that day because he had been arrested as a material witness. And the judge asked him why did he want to testify. He said, well, I want to plead the fifth. The judge told him, well, you can't plead the fifth. He's like, why? He said, because you're not being charged. He said, yeah, but I still want to plead the fifth. And we remember that the Fifth Amendment is protection against criminal prosecution because of some criminal act that you may have committed. So when a person pleads the fifth, the presumption is that they know what the plead the fifth means, that this man is trying to protect himself from being prosecuted for criminal behavior. The judge utterly refused to allow him to plead the fifth. So then they asked him, okay, well, what else is wrong? He said, well, y'all are making me testify, and I'm not mentally ready for this right now. The judge said, why? He said, because he was high on heroin. He testified in open court that he had just used heroin before he came to court. The judge offered to allow him to go back into chambers, to lie down in chambers and drink some water. He then said, okay, well, I want to see my attorney. The judge told him, you don't have a right to see an attorney. They made this guy testify. Now, this is the same guy who was identified by, and let me back up to show you who the case is. I just want to tell you who Kenny Parker was at Ford. Now, it was a home invasion robbery. It was the homeowner was shot and killed by suspects that entered her house. 3 suspects entered her house. The suspects went into her son's bedroom and robbed him allegedly of heroin and money and fled the scene. When the victims were first identified, the surviving victims were first interviewed, they told the police officers that they could not identify the people, that they had on do-rags around their foreheads and around their face that obscured their identification. Well, enters again Robert Ford. So when asked whether or not they knew who it may have been, they began to name the people that had been around their house that day. And they named Tyreek Williams, and they named, one second here, it's actually Gregory Tyreek Williams. Tyreek is his nickname. And they named Lester, they didn't name Lester Lynch. So they asked him, well, who was Tyreek hanging around the state? And they said, oh, well, he had been with a guy who called his brother, Lester Lynch. All right. The crime scene was bloody, lots of blood because of the shooting. And the victim was pistol whipped. They found numerous footprints from different individuals that did not belong to the victims, the occupants of the house. That these footprints belonged to the assailants. One of my guys here, and he's actually standing beside me right now. I'm sorry, 1 second. So Lester was said to have been with Tyreek earlier that day, but no one named him as having been at the crime scene. Well, eventually this case, again, this is the short version. Eventually this case would go to trial. They called Detective Ford called Lester and asked him if he would speak to him. And he asked him why. He said, I want to talk to you about Tyreek, a robbery and a murder. So he She told her, I don't know anything about that. And Ford continued to harass him. Now, one of Ford's tactics, and he has been accused about doing this in hundreds of cases, that he has been accused of forcing witnesses to testify again about things they have no knowledge about. This is his modus operandi. So that's the test. I don't have anything to talk to you about. But he did agree to meet with him with his family on neutral grounds and talk to him. Again, he really told him that, hey, I don't know anything about a robbery. I don't know anything about a murder. I don't know anything about that whatsoever. So eventually, Ford threatened him and told him, hey, if you don't say anything, we're going to charge you. And he's like, okay, you're going to have to because I don't know anything about it. Now, remember the assailants, they posed in there. It came eventually to where one of the witnesses would say that they came there to their house and they were driving Lester's car. Where forensic evidence was done, or tests were done on Lester's car. The shoe prints did not match his shoe sizes. They did not find any blood on any of his shoes at his house. They did not find any blood whatsoever in the car. They did not find any of his fingerprints anywhere in the house that they would say that items he touched but did not take. So there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime scene. Same thing with Tyreek. So what happened was these guys were convicted, and as time would go by, they did not know that the witnesses had given previous statements to the detectives. In fact, Kenneth Parker had given 10 different statements. So when during the course of their trial, they thought that the only statement that was being presented at court was a statement that had been previously made, not knowing that these witnesses had been interviewed numerous times by the police officers and that their stories were evolving.
Wow.
So one of the witnesses, she actually testified that at trial, but the police officer came and testified that she had actually picked Lester out of a photo lineup, and she had written on it, and the officer actually presented this to the court. Well, when they put her on the stand, they asked her whether or not she had picked them out of a photo lineup, and her response was no. They like, well,
you have 1 minute remaining.
Let me call right back, sis.
All right. Yeah, we here, bro.
Okay. Are you ready, sis?
Yes.
Okay. So the case went to trial in July 2002, and they tried them separately, Lester and Gregory. So in 2016, Lester wound up filing a motion for storage and preservation of tangible evidence pursuant to Virginia Code statute. In response to the motion, the Commonwealth and the Norfolk Police Department Evidence Unit responded by letter stating what evidence they still had in storage, and that Iron Mountain Records Management destroyed 3 of the evidence vouchers. And this was actually done at the behest of Detective D.A. Huffman. And Huffman was a long-time partner of Ford. How he wound up getting indicted is just a stretch of the imagination as to how they did not indict him, but they didn't. But he worked hand in hand with Ford on all these murder investigations and solving that they supposedly did. Now, when they filed the motion for the evidence voucher, the Commonwealth attorney came forward and said, "Hey, we destroyed certain tapes." However, they wound up finding the transcripts. Now, they never told them to this date where these transcripts had been hidden because they were not made available during the trial. Now, mind you, this is 16 years later that they finally get their hands on these transcripts. So, the main part of the transcript showed this right here. Now, the witness, Tamika Reed, the prosecutor asked her, "What happened when you showed her the photo lineup?" This is what they asked Detective Huffman. He said, "Miss Reed narrowed it down to 2 people, but she was unable to clearly pick out, or identify Mr. Williams. The court, please make it clear, was Mr. Williams one of the 2? You need to clarify." Detective Huffman said she narrowed it down to 2 people, one being Mr. Williams. I don't recall which one other one was, but she was unable to pick which person. In this sense, you see, he just said she was not able to identify Mr. Williams. Then he turned right back around. The court says, clarify, said he did identify Mr. Williams. Now, that's what he testified to at trial. But according to the court record, the new transcript that they discovered in 2018, but according to the new discovery, it says Tamika Reed was never shown a photo lineup of the petitioner, only one of the petitioner's co-defendant. So meaning Gregory. So Mr. Williams. he never actually been shown a photo lineup of him, period. So contrary to what she testified at trial, and the detective testified at trial, they never shown her a photo lineup of this guy. Also, her sworn testimony was that, one second. His lawyer, Gregory's lawyer asked her, was it your testimony that you picked Mr. Wiggins out of a photo lineup shown to you by Detective Hussman? Ms. Reed said, no. I identified Lester Lynch by photo, but you never identified Mr. Williams. She says no. Now, and that turns out to be false also. Now watch this right here. When Lester went to trial, he was acquitted. I'm sorry, he had 2 hung juries. The juries absolutely refused to convict this man and send him to prison twice. When I say the evidence was thin at best, it was evidence based solely on officer keep coming and providing these officers with more and more information about him as if they knew it at the previous trial. So each trial, witnesses began to know more and more about this guy until they finally was able to convict him. He has no criminal record. He's never been in prison before. This guy was a family man. He was married. He raised his children. He had a great job. He was not a guy that was out the street and getting into trouble. Now, he testified about the mask, which says, Gregory's lawyer asked her, it is your testimony he came in that night and without any disguise or mask or anything came in your room and pistol whipped you and robbed him. So he asked this to the other victim and robbed you. Somebody you knew who knew it. Is that right? He said, this guy, Ronald Scott, he said, yes, sir. So at trial, he testified that the people came in, pistol whipped him and robbed him, and they didn't have any mask. As we can all understand, you're definitely going to know who this was that did this, especially if it's someone that you already knew. But according to the new discovered evidence, now remember, they didn't know about the mask situation until 16 years later. So the new transcript that they found that they never turned over to them, the transcripts actually said, Detective Hoffman asked them, describe to me the 2 people that were in the front that had the guns and what they were wearing. Ronald Scott said they was brown skin and they was wearing half scarves tied around the forehead and around the chins. So the guys in the front of them, the detective says, 2 guys. So the 2 guys in the front that were demanding the money and hit you with the guns, you said you immediately recognized both of them, even though they had bandanas on. And then he said, I recognize, but I think they were brothers. So, contrary to him saying that they had no mask on, he says he recognized them, then he says he don't recognize them, then he said they had masks on. So, but this evidence, of course, has to be scrutinized by a jury. The jury can say, oh, wait, he could have been confused, but the problem was it was never turned over to allow their attorneys to develop the evidence. If this guy's been pistol whipped, he's saying if guys have masks on, he's saying they don't have masks on, they and lawyer have a right to develop this to show that this witness is maybe confused. Maybe he's been beaten so bad his mother was just shot and killed from him. Maybe he was beaten and bad, he was in such distress that he don't know who did this to him. But they didn't turn it over. Now, you have Detective Huffman, Detective Ford, hands all over this case. We know what their modus operandi is. They bring a witness in that says, okay, this is what happened. Now, watch this. One of the guys that they identified as being the one that robbed them was KP, Kenny Parker. So, Kenny Parker, remember we started off talking about how Detective Ford was indicted by the feds. Kenny Parker now testifies in Ford's federal case in 2010, 8 years after my guys have been locked up. Kenny Parker now testified that, hey, I was paying Detective Ford money to get me out of trouble. So eventually, mind you, there was heroin and money, but there was allegedly robbed from Ronald Scott during his home invasion robbery. So it came out that in 2000 and they would not give a reason as to how Ford was able to do this, how he was able to keep pulling strings for Kenny Parker. So Kenny Parker was actually indicted by the feds in 2000 and I have the article right here. Okay, here it is. I'm sorry. All right. charged with dealing 22 pounds of heroin and 110 pounds of cocaine. Now, this is the guy that was initially named by the witnesses as being one of the guys that broke in the house, committed this murder of his mother, and robbed him. And he knew him very well. He didn't know Lester, and he said he barely knew Gregory. But Kenny Parker was an associate of his that he was bound and selling drugs with. And he initially said this was the guy that robbed him. Well, with Detective Ford, who do you think got the deal? Right. Detective Ford actually used Kenny Parker as his witness. Gave him immunity and had him testify and lie and say that Gregory and Lester were the ones that went ahead and committed this murder. No one can explain this to this day as to how this was allowed to happen. So you have two men sitting in prison, and I call them the Ford's forgotten victims. There are cases in which they were witness to look into, but because Ford was involved in so many murder cases and so many murder convictions, they would not go back and do their due diligence and go and say, hey, this man's dirty fingerprints have been all over these cases. There are guys up and down this state while sitting in prison doing decades to life in prison for crimes that they have claimed they did not commit. Evidence is being uncovered showing that witnesses flat out lied. Witnesses testified in court, hey, this is what I told the detective. Then you found out years later that they actually gave other statements contradicting everything they said. Right. The judge in this case is so egregiously horrible, they allowed a witness to get on the stand, try to plead the fifth. No, you can't do that. Ask for an attorney. No, you can't have one. The man told them outright in court he was high on heroin. The judge said, okay, you can go in my chamber, lay down and drink some water. Now, remind you, Lester and Gregory's cases were tried separately. So Lester did not know during his trial that the witness had testified that he was high on heroin when he was giving testimony. And that he did not want to testify. He was being forced to testify. These facts were not being made known to these guys. They were never given fair trials. Right now, they're in the midst of filing a motion to vacate pursuant to Virginia Code 8.01-428D. We are trying to obtain help from our attorneys. I just obtained my paralegal degree, and I am willing to work with any attorney that will come and help with these guys' cases. I will work with you free of charge. I know the cases like the back of my hand. There are certain details I'm not going to put out here on the air right now because we're going to use that in his motion that further supports what I'm saying here. Everything that I've spoken about with regard to these guys' cases, we have every document to back it up. So we're asking you all to please go to Basil Abdul, go to my Instagram page. I'm gonna have this interview posted up there. I'm gonna be posting things about the case on that page for now, and I'm due to go home in about 160 days, so I'll be out there soon. And Gregory Williams and Lester Lynch, please help us to reach out to the Norfolk District Attorney's Office to join this motion to vacate because they have the power to right this wrong.